Most of you that are taking this class are mandatory reporters. And we'll be talking about that, about why is someone a mandatory reporter by title or profession or education and others aren't. Because there is some confusing information out there, so we'll be discussing that. Now, we're going to be talking about child abuse. A lot of information, and it kind of hits pretty hard, but we'll get through it. Child abuse isn't new. There are actually cave drawings that have a pornography in them that are child abuse. So it isn't something that is new. But the first time that a case actually came to court in the United States was in 1874. And it wasn't even about a child or a specific child abuse situation. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals took the first case to court, saying that children should have the same rights as animals. It wasn't until 1978, 104 years later, that Iowa had a child abuse code. So it isn't anything new. It's been here a long time with the problems. We just haven't addressed them very much until just recently. Iowa does have a code on child abuse. And it's something you need to realize is the difference between civil law and criminal. I'm not an attorney. I have no intention of teaching law. But you need to realize that the Department of Human Services, which is responsible for child abuse and child abuse codes, they are civil law. They do not have the ability to arrest anybody, to take them to court, to incarcerate them. In order to move it from civil code to criminal code, it's going to have to involve law enforcement, county attorney, the judges, the criminal justice system. And so it's hard to understand because we believe, that child abuse is against the law, and it is. But it's against civil law and then has to be taken to criminal. And we'll talk about the differences with that. In order to do a child abuse report, you have to have three pieces. You have to have the child, you have to have a caretaker, and you have to have a circumstance. Okay? 3 C's with it. So then the definitions. The definition of a child is anyone under the age of 18. It's as simple as that. But some problems we get into it is, if any of you have dealt with teenagers, you have teenagers, it can be kind of tough population to be working with. I saw this advertisement, and it should show up about, do you speak teen? And I think we're finding that that's a major problem. We're talking about, we're just learning how to do text messaging, where kids have their whole language evolved around it. They already know how to do those things. And so sometimes it's tough because we're not talking the same language. Lots of kids want their own national anthem and their own flag. They don't want to be part of us. So when we come to an abuse situation, they don't want to share. And so it's going to be really tough if you're talking about abuse situations and teenagers. And a caretaker, the definition of a caretaker, who is responsible for the care of a child. You stop and think about how many of you believe that a teacher, an educator, is a caretaker. By law, they're not. By law, they are a mandatory reporter, but by law, they are not a caretaker. Sometimes we can fall into the role of a caretaker without even realizing what the problem would be or the situation. If my children are down the street playing with your children, you have assumed the responsibility of a caretaker, and you may not know my kids are there. And so sometimes, we fall into that role of caretaker without, making that deliberate decision with it. Now, if something happens, could you be charged? Yes, it would just depend on the circumstances, what your involvement is, etc. Will you be? Who knows? It's going to depend on what's going on with that particular case. The other thing, though, sometimes is, let's talk about babysitters. Sometimes babysitters are caregivers. And I'm not talking about a child care, a daycare center. Like if I have an older child that is babysitting for one of my younger children, they are in a caretaking role. If you have hired one of my children to take care of your children, they are in a caretaking role. So then if something happens, if there are the circumstances or an abusive incident, who's responsible? And once again, it's going to have to be looked at, what are the circumstances? If my child is old enough, mature enough, capable of taking care of one of my younger children or your children, and they are the perpetrator, so that, they've got that knowledge of it, it is something that is really a deliberate action on their part, it could in fact be that they're charged as a juvenile. But if, in fact, it's a problem that, was something that you hired the wrong person, or I hired, I had my older sibling take care of a younger, it could be my fault, it could be your fault. And so each situation is going to have to be looked at as far as who is the caretaker under those circumstances. and then the circumstance. What is that abusive incident? And sometimes it isn't really a solid piece of information. It may be something that we just see. It could even be little peripheral vision pickup on there. It could be something, it's that feeling in your gut. Your stomach feels a little queasy. It could be what raises the hair on the back of your neck. So sometimes it's just that spidey sense. It's just one of those extra senses that you pick up. That, wait, there's a problem here. I don't know what it is. We need to look into it. And so it may not be something just really rock solid that you can say, I saw that happen. I heard them say that. So the circumstance can be what is suspected. The other thing is it is our responsibility to report suspected abuse. It is not our responsibility to investigate. It's not our responsibility to solve the problem, the situation. It is our responsibility to report suspected abuse. There is an exception, and hopefully none of you wrote this law. It's one of those things, those exceptions that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I said you have to have 3 C's: child, caretaker, circumstance. The exception to that is if you have a child that is under the age of 12, they are sexually assaulted, and there's no caretaker, it still would fit the law for child abuse. And we're missing that 3rd C, the caretaker. So if my kids decide to stay after school to play on the playground, all the adults are gone, all of the caretakers, all the custodians, the teachers, everybody's gone. Somebody comes out of the woods and sexually assaults my 11-year-old. So we have a child because she's 11. We have a sexual assault, and there's no caretaker there. That still would meet the child abuse law, even without the 3rd C. But what about her 12-year-old sister that is also there playing? So I've got a 12-year-old there and an 11-year-old. The same guy turns around and sexually assaults my 12-year-old. We have a child because she's 12. We have a sexual assault, and we have no caretaker. It doesn't meet child abuse. That's going to have to in turn skip to criminal code under sexual assault. It doesn't make any sense. But just be aware of the fact that not all the times do laws make a lot of sense with it. Okay? We're going to talk about the types of offenders. And we really need to think about it. We're talking about it. We need to talk about it professionally, but then we also need to think about it as far as parents, other types of caretakers that we're going to be dealing with. The first one, as far as well-intentioned but overwhelmed. There are times we have nothing left. There are times we have absolutely, as a professional, we have no coping skills left. We have a storm. It could be a tornado. It could be a flood. It could be a snowstorm. There are times that we can't get to work. There are times we're short of staff. There are times that people have the flu. There are times that, as a professional, we have nothing left to run on. And so at those particular times when we have no coping skills left, we're totally overwhelmed, we can step over the line and become an offender. But what about parenting? There are some really phenomenal parents out there. We're not by this class saying that all parents, all caretakers are bad people. I'm not saying that. But what about the times that they are totally overwhelmed also? A couple years ago, actually it was in 2008, Cedar Rapids got hit with major flooding. There were a lot of people that were out of jobs. There were a lot of jobs that had been totally wiped out. There were a lot of families without homes. There was a lot of stress. The Department of Public Health sent a team of surveyors into Cedar Rapids to talk to the flood victims about mental health and physical health. When they came back, they were talking about something that they had never experienced before. Usually when you're doing any type of an assessment, especially on mental health assessment, eventually the question comes up, have you ever considered suicide? And then the second question, if they say yes, the second question is, what, did you try it? And if the answer to that is yes, it's what did you try? When the surveyors went in to talk to the flood victims in Cedar Rapids, they didn't even get to that question. Right up front, before they ever got to those types of questions about suicide, there was a high number of adults, really super people in Cedar Rapids that said, to be really honest, it's so bad I've thought about committing suicide, and I know what I would have done. And so we had people that were just fantastic people that were just overwhelmed, had absolutely no coping skills left. So you can have people that are going to step over that line into an offender category. If, in fact, professionals, good people step over the line, generally it's verbal. We say something we shouldn't have said, we use a voice we shouldn't have used. If, in fact, especially when we're talking about child abuse, if it's physical, generally it's that tap, might be a swat on the backside. We're not talking about beating somebody up, beating the snot out of somebody. But it is still an offense. We're still an offender when we don't have the right to be that either as a good parent, caretaker, or a professional. When we're talking about well-intentioned but ignorant, I think all of us have been in a situation where they hired somebody, it just didn't fit. Sometimes, I like to say, that they hired an idiot. And I think there have been times all of us have been in an employment situation where it's like, why is it my responsibility to teach them how to do their job? So sometimes we've got the wrong fit. But then what about students? There are times that they don't know everything coming into it, especially the newer the student. They don't know a lot. New employees, they don't know policies and procedures. They may not even know the environment well enough. Where are supplies? Who can I ask? What about new graduates? Even a new physician, but a new registered nurse. They don't know everything. And so there are times, that in fact they can step over that line into an offender category. But then what about a 14-year-old? What about a 14-year-old that has given birth to a child and has chosen to keep the child? They haven't even been an adult, have never been an adult. They've only been a teenager for a couple of years, and yet they have taken on the responsibility of a newborn. One of the classic examples that we see is Kool-Aid in a baby bottle. Now an older child, Kool-Aid would be okay. A newborn, inappropriate. And so we're talking about someone that had the best intentions of the world to give birth, to keep a child, but is not prepared, is not capable of really taking care of that child to the extent that they should be. And then we have people that are unwilling, could care less. And that can happen, especially if we're talking any tough economic times. We can have people that are taking jobs for a paycheck. Doesn't matter what the job is. I need to put food on the table. I will work. I will work at anything. And so we see those things happening anytime we have a loss of employment, any economic changes. But then likewise, we have people that are caretakers that they're the wrong fit again. They really shouldn't be taking care of children. What about the single mom? What about the single mom that has decided to get back into the dating game? Regardless of why she's single, a lot of times it reaches the point, she's ready to step back out again. But a lot of times what happens is, if she looks in her checkbook, if she has one, or in her billfold, and she looks at, do I have money for a babysitter, or do I have money to go out? So sometimes that judgment call is based on economics. I don't have money for both. And she needs to be out badly enough, she will choose to not hire a babysitter. As soon as that decision has been made, the children are at risk. The quieter the kids are, like say they're already down for the evening, the more at risk they are because she stopped thinking about them. Her mind is on something totally different. But then let's switch it about to a potential new guy in her life. She goes into, generally we're talking about, a social environment. It could be a sports bar, a dance situation. So say that she, walks up to introduce herself. She wouldn't say, hey, my name's Di and I have 5 kids. That new guy in her life has no intention of coming there to be an instant dad. And so there's a good probability that it'll be a while into any relationship before he may even realize there are children. And so once again, the kids are at risk. And now they're at risk with 2 situations. They have mom, who isn't considering them, completely considering them, and we have a new guy that may not be considering them at all. And so the kids are at risk when we're talking about unwilling, could care less. The last 2, which are the abusive personality and the sadistic personality, these are both psychosocial deviants. The abusive personality is the best example I've ever heard is a flasher. If you think about a flasher, it's a psychosocial, it's a sexual deviant. It goes like this, we go, and they just won. They don't want us to touch. They don't want any interaction, actually. They don't want any hands-on. They just want to actually startle us. The abusive personality is always looking for an audience. And kids make the best audience there is. If you think about a child from the time they're born, they're in a fantasy world. We have Big Bird, and we have Barney, and we have Mickey Mouse, and we have, I don't know how many Disney channels there are. There are bedtime stories, there are fairy tales. So kids are always in a fantasy world, and we kind of feed that. And so when they have someone who's willing to perform, it may be a while before they realize that they are in a situation that is dangerous to them because they're used to being entertained. The sadistic personality is 100% pain and control. That person is looking for a victim. The more that they can hurt us, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally, psychologically, the better off they are. They're always looking for a victim. And once again, kids make great victims. It depends on if they're being threatened. It depends on how old they are, their understanding of what's going on. So children really do make great victims. The problem is when we look at all 5 categories of offenders, we need to realize we're going to find them everywhere that we find children. They are there. We need to be aware of the fact that they are there. The last 2 categories, the abusive personality and the sadistic personality, are even more dangerous in addition to what I've talked about, is that very, very often they are very good caregivers. Because if they weren't, if someone reports them and we know that it happened, their name's going to be on the abuse registry for 10 years. They will not work. So if they can't work with children and they can't work with dependent adults if they're on the registry, who are they going to abuse? Who's going to be their audience? Who's going to be their victim? Because they're not going to be able to work with them. So you need to be aware of the fact that the offenders are everywhere that we find our children. There are 9 categories of child abuse, including those of you who have had previous courses. The most recent change did happen in 2009. So there was a change in 2009 with that, and we will be going through them individually. When we're talking about physical abuse generally is non-accidental. So if you say, I really accidentally tripped them, or I accidentally did this, there are problems, there are injuries that are caused by accidents. But we're talking about abuse issues, things that are non-accidental. And then there's that variance with history. Doesn't mean always, but generally there's an element of that. And so you're talking to a child that is mature enough, is capable of speech, and the child says, Mom shoved me down the stairs. Mom can't let that ride, because she's just been accused of something. And so she's either going to say, you have been told you never interrupt when adults are talking. She's got to get that conversation stopped. Or she may say, I am so sorry. He lies. He lies all the time. It's horrible. He lies about everything. It didn't happen. There's got to be some way that parent, that caretaker is going to stop what you're listening to put the blame actually on the child rather than on the caretaker. If you have a child that is not mature enough or incapable of speech to tell you what's going on, you're really going to have to look at that nonverbal. What do you see happening? What do you see as the interaction? What do other people say or have said about it? And so there's usually that element at variance with history. And then omissions. The word omissions, when we're talking about abuse, and you're going to see that word throughout almost all of the different categories of abuse, basically it means if you omit the safety, you're just as guilty. So if my significant other is physically abusive to me, there would be a probability that he would be abusive to my children, and yet I leave my children with him. If I come home and my children have been physically abused, he can be charged as the perpetrator. I can be charged with physical abuse by omission because they omitted to keep my kids safe. And then what's foreseeable? If I look out here and there's this busy street out here, and there's my 2-year-old standing out in the middle of the street, if I don't do anything, it is foreseeable my child's going to get hurt. A vehicle either won't get to stop on time or may not even see the size of a 2-year-old. So if I don't do anything, it's foreseeable that my child's going to be injured. So I run across the yard, I grab the child, I run back to safety. In the process of that, I accidentally scratch them. That's not foreseeable. Every time you grab someone or pick someone up, hold them, you don't scratch them. So that's not foreseeable. But I'm upset. I haven't run a 100-yard dash since I was a senior in high school. I'm out of breath. It's hard to breathe. The heart's pounding, and I'm upset. I almost lost my 2-year-old. And I grab him, and I start shaking him. What were you doing out there? You're never supposed to be there. Now is it foreseeable that my actions are going to injure the child? It is, because I'm shaking a child. I'm really hot. They have been told they are never to leave the yard. That they're not to break that rule. And I take off my belt. Now is it foreseeable my child will be injured by my actions? Yes. Especially if I reverse it and use the buckle end. So that layer of, is it foreseeable? And then it doesn't have to be observable. If you have a 12-year-old that comes in and says they've been spanked so hard the night before it hurts to sit down, you don't say, drop your drawers, let me see. You don't have to observe it at all. If they've told you that they have been injured and in an abusive situation of any kind, that's enough for the report. You are reporting suspected abuse. In that case, it would be a verbal report. The child told me that. And so you don't have to actually even observe the injury. The other thing that makes that really important is as long as the child is under the age of 18, as long as they are still by law a child, They can report anything to you that happened in their past. You still have got to make a child abuse report. So say you have a 17-year-old that said when they were 12 that they had been sexually assaulted, or it had a broken bone, something like that. It is still reportable. Even obviously there would be no way you could have observed something that happened 5 years ago. And so that's part of it. It does not have to be observable in order to make that report. But once again, you would report what did the child say. Unfortunately, as and not part of it, unfortunately, but as adults, we use a lot of nonverbal. I know I talk a lot with my hands, and in fact, my dad said, if you tied Mom and I's hands up, we wouldn't be able to talk at all. So we have a habit of using a lot of nonverbal. When we're talking to a child about abuse, sometimes we forget about that. We may say, did your mommy do this? Without even being aware of the fact that we are cueing them in on something. We may not be aware. And so they have just trusted us with some information. They may agree that Mommy did it, when in fact it might not have been. So we have to be very, very careful. It is not our responsibility to investigate. It's not our responsibility to prove or disprove. It's our responsibility to report suspected abuse. So a couple safe questions to ask. One is, have you ever been hurt like this before? And that very well could come up with that statement of, every time Mom goes off the wagon, I get hurt. Every time Dad's laid off, I get hit. So you may find out those pieces of the puzzle that would be part of your report. The other safe question to ask is, do you hurt anywhere else? It could in fact be that 12-year-old that's been spanked so hard it hurts to sit down. You may actually also been kicked in the ribs. It could be in fact the damage to the ribs is more serious than where they've been spanked or beaten, but the pain is greater, and so he may not have thought of telling you that in fact there's more damage to another part of the body. So you can ask that, do you hurt anywhere else? And there would be something else then to report with it. Now, this is not an eye chart, and I realize it's very, very small. If you have downloaded any of it, you'll realize it's probably even smaller than that. So the purpose isn't to strain your vision. The purpose is to say, though, that when we're talking about physical abuse, that it can be in an ascending order of severity. It can start with scratches, cuts, and bruises, which could be very minor. It could start in the middle somewhere. It could start all the way at the top, which is murder and death. Sometimes, if it starts at the bottom and the frustrations, the aggravations, etc., escalate, you can see it jump in categories. So you can see different changes in it. But something else to think about is, what is the importance to the child? As you're talking about, scratches, cuts, and bruises, it may really be minor, but the child may consider it's very, very major. So you need to kind of listen to what is the child really telling you. Obviously, what does it look like, etc., without placing that importance of it. So sometimes children lie about things too. So it may strictly be what the child thinks is important to them. So take that into consideration, but still consider all the levels of abuse. When we're talking about burns, burns look like what are used. Cigarette burn is usually a small round circle. Remember, we're talking about abuse. Sometimes we'll have a caretaker say, but it wasn't deliberate. I was just flicking the ashes off, and the child just reached in the way. You can't have two moving objects in a round circle. And so that story doesn't match. You say, what am I seeing? What does it look like? If you're talking about rope burns, generally we're talking about someone being tied up, and we're usually talking about wrists and ankles. Sometimes we'll see them other places. Sometimes we will see rope burns on the neck. We may see them on the body. But you can usually see that that's what happened, and sometimes it's severe enough you can actually take fibers out and know what kind of a rope was used. If you're talking about a coil type of burn, usually we're talking an electric stove. Generally, we will find that either on hands or even on bottoms, that they've actually been seated, placed down on that coil. A steam iron is going to end up with a point. Curling irons are going to be long and skinny. We still see some in our older buildings where you've got that cast iron radiator type of heat. You may see some really wide type of burns. So you can usually say, I know what was used to do this. If you're talking liquid burns, generally we're talking about coffee or water. When fry babies were popular several years ago, your personal deep fat fryer, we still see some of them around. We saw more grease burns than we're seeing, but you may still see something that is more than either just coffee or water. With children, you will either see that a body part is grabbed and dunked. If they're dunked hand first, the burn actually will end, almost like the child's wearing a glove a burned surface, that it will end at a straight line. If a foot is grabbed and dumped, and especially like into hot bath water, it'll look like it'll stop at a straight line the depth of the liquid. Sometimes those are actually called anklet burns because it's where a stocking would end with it. The other time, though, that you'll see a dunking type of burn with children, you may see that, especially with a chronic bedwetter or a child that they're having a tough time toilet training, you may see a child that's bent, knee-chest position and dunked bottom first. And once again, you're going to see that, just that straight line of the burn. With coffee and water, the other type of burn you see with it is a splash. And what you'll see with that is literally it's been thrown at them. Most of the time, that's just in total frustration. It's one of those almost spur-of-the-moment, they didn't think about it, and just throw a hot liquid at a child. That's going to be an amoeba type effect. It won't be a straight line with it. So burns, you can usually always tell what was used. Think about if you ever had a crack in the corner of your mouth. And sometimes we actually even have both of them. And what we usually say, especially as an adult, is it's wintertime in Iowa, the humidity is down, because that's usually when we have a problem with it. Sometimes we need to look outside the box. What else do you see? If someone's going to gag me, first of all, they're going to have to catch me. Then they're going to have to tie me up, because I'm going to fight. And so they're going to have to tie it tight enough to shut me up. And I'm going to be able to still teach this club. And as soon as they reach that point that the person can't talk about it, now these are really stressed and potentially will tear the soft tissue on the mouth. But the same thing is, if you can't fight with your arms, with your body, you will fight with your tongue. It's like getting a popcorn hull caught. Why don't we get dental floss out? Instead, we work and work and work. It'll be the same thing. We'll see a straight line bruise across the tongue. We may see straight line bruises across one or both earlobes. We may see missing hair across the back, because when they take the gag off, they'll yank hair with it. May take out a pierced earring, and then we may actually see a deeper tears here. And think outside the box that it's more than wintertime in Iowa and the humidity is low. When we skip up to the middle one with hypothermia, low body temperature, sometimes that's the kid's fault. If any of you saw the old movie about Christmas Story, Mom wraps the kid up, he looks like a kidney bean, and he's all dressed in purple and he just can hardly move. That was a movie. And now for the real child, other than a movie situation, they may waddle a couple houses away from home, but you can guarantee they're not going to school looking like that. So as soon as they get enough away from home, they're going to take off whatever they don't want their friends to see them wearing. And so, in fact, it may be the caretaker tried to protect the child, and the child doesn't want to wear that. It also could be that their favorite football team is the Cowboys and not the Packers, and they just have a Packer jacket given to them. So there's a lot of reasons why a child may not dress warmly. My office is about 2 blocks from a high school, and as soon as it hits 40 degrees, the kids are out there wearing flip-flops, short shorts, tank top, and a cell phone. And it's 40 degrees out, and so their potential of hypothermia is there. But I also discovered the reason for it, and that's because they stand at the bus stops and get a group hug. And so they get to warm themselves up by having these little other bodies they get to snuggle up with. So sometimes it's what is the child wearing. If it's an abuse situation, generally it is either that the child has been tied or caged, where they can't move, they can't generate their own body heat, or they're confined. They may confine to a shed outside in cold weather or the garage. It might be an unheated closet, it could be under the porch, or crawl space, might be the basement, which is damp and cool. And so if you're finding a hypothermia with a child, that it's usually where they are confined or in what way, that they can't generate a body heat. When you look at starvation and dehydration, we don't see, if I were to say to close your eyes and picture someone that's starving to death, most of us, our brains would jump to a third world country. Because a lot of, especially older adults, grew up in a National Geographic era. We saw the pictures. We can see the little sticks, skin and bones type of children, little pot belly. That's what our brain would jump us to. Because in the United States, we don't see as much of that physical starvation as we see behavior. With a child, I don't know if you've ever been passing a convenience store when you've seen a kid run. And a lot of times it's because they have stolen something. Now, it might be an object that they really want. It might be an object that has a resale value for whatever reason that they want the money. But a lot of times it is food. If they steal food, it's usually because they really are hungry. They stole it and they ran. Their body will instinctively pick a candy bar over a banana. Yes, it tastes better and we want it more, but even their body will recognize the fact it's a higher energy than a banana would be instantly. And so we see that behavior. When we're talking about any type of a medical situation, a medical center, a hospital, anytime we're taking care of a child, what we might see again with behavior, you deliver a meal tray to them, check back a little bit later, and nothing's been touched. Check back again just a little bit later, poof, like magic, it's gone. There's no way the child could have eaten everything that fast. If you check their room, first of all, anything that is not covered, so anything like crackers, pudding cups, beverages, so anything that isn't sealed, they'll eat as fast as they can. Meat, potatoes, gravy, a lot of times veggies, a salad, they'll eat really fast, so you can't take it away from them. But if you check your room, you're going to find they have hoarded the things that are wrapped. A couple reasons for that. They know what hunger is like. They know that in the middle of the night when they get hungry, they've got a stash. They know that isn't going to happen. But the other thing, a lot of times, the other part of it is psychological. They get to go home the hero. A lot of times they have brothers and sisters at home that are also hungry. And now they get to take a gift of food home to their siblings. And so we see more of the behavior in the United States than we see that skin and bone starvation. The other thing, I know most of the medical people are familiar with the term turgor or skin turgor as a measure of hydration. And so, and you can actually teach your children, you can teach, patients, other people to do it, is simply just pick up the skin on the back of a hand and let it go. If it goes down really fast, your level of hydration or fluid's pretty good. If it stays up, it means there's a level of dehydration there. Because of a medical problem, I really am slightly dehydrated all the time. So mine stays peaked up. I kind of jokingly say I'm about a quart low. A couple minutes ago, I was doing a class, and no one knew about turgor or no medical people in the room. And when I went to show somebody, before I could say that was because I was slightly dehydrated, the lady in front of me said, it's because you're old. It's not a sign of age. It is a sign of dehydration with it. Okay? So that's something that you can take. You never know when it's going to be of value to teach somebody that, so they can check to make sure they're getting adequate fluids with it. We don't see a lot of contractures in children. Unless it's someone like with cerebral palsy, we may see in the contractures when the ligaments, the tendons, the muscles of the joints contract, shrink. The best visual is cerebral palsy, so if you know anybody with CP, you've seen what a contracture looks like. The other time that we may see it in a child is if the child has been tied up or confined in a small space, caged, even tied up in a baby bed where they can't move around and exercise. You may see that they're starting to lose that mobility in their joints. So we don't see as many actual contractures in children as we see in adults. The top of the next scale is a detached retina. The retina is the back of our eyeball. It's what allows us to see. The number one cause of a detached retina in a child is shaken baby. The baby's grabbed and shaken. Literally, their brain and their skull are banging together, and it can tear or detach the retina. The second leading cause of a detached retina in a child is slammed baby. Dropped head first, picked up and whopped against a wall, a tabletop, that hard surface. But if you think about a child the size of a child that you could pick up and shake, or a child that you could pick up and slam, we're talking about our very smallest small children, or our youngest children. And because of that, because of their age or their size, they're not going to be able to tell us that there's suddenly only part of their vision that they can't see, or that it looks like broken glass, that there's a problem there. And so unfortunately, because they can't tell us there's a problem, they're not going to end up with an emergency procedure enough usually to save their sight. And so you're going to find out we're going to have some potential sight, some vision problems, including blindness, one or both eyes with it. We're going to be talking about fractures in a little bit. With pressure sores, we don't see as many of those in children as we see adults. But where we do see them usually is in a child that the diapers aren't being changed. Starts out with diaper rash, but they're not being changed, and eventually the hard surface of a bed or the floor, whatever, and the wetness of the skin can cause that start and that breakdown, which will end up as a pressure sore. You could have it with a chronic bedwetter, especially the caretaker said, you wet them, you live in them, where they won't allow the child to change wet soiled clothes. And then it's the same thing. You can see that breakdown that's going to eventually lead to pressure sores. And we just don't see them as much in children as we see them in adults. With choke marks, the purpose of choking anyone is to choke them to death. I know that's the major reason for a choke. If the perpetrator thinks about it, so it's premeditated, they're going to come armed. A necktie, a wire, a cord, a rope, something to get the job done. But a lot of times it is just that total frustration, spur of the moment, that type of thing. And once it's done, once you lock your fingers in any type of stressful situation, that's really tough to unlock those. So sometimes, even though the intent wasn't to go all the way to choke them to death, sometimes that does go ahead and happen. You'll actually be able to count anywhere up to 8 fingerprints in front, 2 in the back, if they've gotten the job done. Sometimes it's reversed. It just depends, if it's how they're grabbing the person to get that choke accomplished. Okay. When we're talking about murder and death, we've lost a lot of kids in Iowa. We find them in abandoned buildings, in empty vehicles. We find them in garbage cans, dumpsters, in ditches. We find children that are thrown away. In 2001, Iowa legislator passed a Safe Haven Act. And basically what that meant is that as long as the child was under 14 days of age, so they had to be less than 2 weeks old, if the child was taken to any medical-based organization, facility, etc., the parents or the caretakers would not be charged with endangerment or abandonment. It wouldn't have to be a hospital or a medical center. It could be a doctor's office, it could be a dentist's office. It could be a school nurse. It could be anything. It could be a nursing facility. Anything, as long as there was some type of medical base there, the child could be taken back. I can't do this anymore. I don't want this child. I can't take care of them. And there wouldn't be any charges filed. If you were following what happened in Nebraska in early 2009, they passed a Safe Haven Act, but they didn't put an age on it. They had more 16-year-olds taken back than any other age group. So, and dealing with teenagers, I can understand. I can't do this anymore. So they had to change that and put a limit on it. In Iowa, since 2001, with the Safe Haven, there have been 18 babies whose lives have been saved because of Safe Haven, that potentially would have lost if they hadn't been able to be taken somewhere safe. And so we do have laws to protect the children. But also we have situations with a mom in the Des Moines area that drowned her newborn and hanged herself. So we had a murder-suicide situation. If I say Shelby Duez, some of you will remember an absolutely adorable blonde 3-year-old with a drug-related murder. Gisetta Gage, we're talking about a sexually related homicide. And so there are some names that we aren't going to forget just because of the situations with the child. Nationally, this last year, there was a 14-year-old that gave birth to a child in the bathroom at school. Because of layering and body structure, sometimes it's really hard to actually realize that somebody is pregnant. So a lot of people didn't even realize that she was pregnant, let alone that close to birth. She gave birth to the child in the bathroom, she panicked, and she tried to flush it. And if you think plumbing, newborn, and the baby drowned. So we have a 14-year-old responsible for the death of a child. You also had a situation at most medical centers in most communities. The first baby born of the new year. We really honor life and we celebrate life the first day of the year. Most of that first baby that's born in most medical centers the first day of the year, they get cute little outfits and they get extra formula and extra diapers and all that. The first baby born in the United States, January 1st of 2008, died in March 2008. It was a family. There had been no domestic violence reports. There had been no previous child abuse reports, although there were 2 older children. And so there hadn't been any known background or any history of any violence with it. Mom left the newborn with Dad. When Mom came home, she found the newborn was unresponsive in his swing. She got him to the emergency room where he was pronounced dead. When they checked the child over, the child had been shaken so hard, there was so much intracranial bleeding that there was the pressure of the bleed that caused the death of the child. Even had the child lived, the child had been shaken so hard, both retina were detached. And so there would be a probability that the child would be blind in both eyes. When they checked his little body, he actually had 8 fingerprints, 2 thumbprints on his rib cage. Father couldn't get him to stop crying. He grabbed the child and had shaken him It caused the death of the child. So now we have a family that not only is missing a newborn, but they're missing dad because he is serving time. And so we can have them that start all the way at the bottom with scratches, cuts, and bruises. We can have them actually that start all the way at the top with murder and death. And there's a wide range in between. We're going to look at some pictures. Not going into a lot of detail about them. If you choose to shut your eyes or turn away, that is your call on that. Child was taken to the emergency room. Caretakers said that the child was crawling on the floor in the living room, slipped on the carpet, and ran the side of his face into the leg of the coffee table. Well, number one, the child isn't old enough to be crawling. Crawling isn't something that he could do. So right up front, the story doesn't match. In addition to that, when you look at the damage that's done, normally a table leg wouldn't hit straight on. You would hit it at a specific one of the edges to it. So it doesn't match. And so it would obviously have to be a report, and probably should be a report right up front, just the amount of damage to an infant to that size. And in addition to that, the story. So the caretakers, when challenged, said, you're right, that isn't what happened. You know, he was in his infant carrier on the couch, and we didn't have it secured. And when he moved, the whole thing rolled off the couch, and he landed on his face on the carpet. That's probably what happened. That's more logical than their first story. The problem is we've had a story that's changed, and we have too much damage done. But something else from now on that I want you to think about when you look at bruises, and it doesn't matter whether it's on you or someone else, I want you to think rainbow. Because you know that bruises change color. If you see bruises on somebody that are different colors within the same areas, you know, chances are it's more than one injury. So, you know, think rainbow as multiple colors, multiple time frames of injury. And, you know, a child this age, an infant this age, you know, they don't break curfew, they don't talk back. You know, the only thing a child this age does is they eat, they sleep, they cry, you know, they have to have their diapers changed. This child has been slapped so hard that those darker stripes on the side of her face is actually the space between the fingers. You know, so the child was slapped like this, and it caused that type of stripe, type of bruising. This child was beaten with their clothes off. I don't know what was actually used to strike the child, you know, but it was something that would actually break the skin. It could have been a branch off of a tree. It could have been a belt buckle. Could have been anything, a bent metal ruler edge. You know, but likewise, look at it from the standpoint of rainbow. Not only do we have new bruises of your dark reds and your purples and your blues, but we also have browns and greens and yellows of older bruises. So this isn't the first time that the child has been struck. Listen, we don't think about ears. You know, like, when's the last time you thought about your ears? You change a pierced earring, or you get water in it. Otherwise, they just kind of hang there. You know, we don't think about our ears that much. When I was in second grade, our music teacher had us sit in this big circle on the floor. You know, and he'd walk the outside circle. And if any of us misbehaved, he just would come along and pick us up by our ears. You know, full body weight on our ears. Now think of how much damage potentially is there. The other thing that we don't think about is that our actual hearing mechanism is not outside of the body, it's inside the skull. So our ability to hear is inside our skull. So there could be just as much damage inside as there is outside. This child, actually, the bruising goes all the way back to that hairline with it. There could be just as easily that much bruising or internal bleeding as there is on the outside. This child does have a broken eardrum with a pressure pop, how they had been struck. This child could very easily be that 12-year-old that tells you that they've been hit so hard that it hurts to sit down. The child was beaten with a PVC pipe, you know, your white plastic conduit. You know, bites are something else we don't think a lot about. Now, if this were a dog bite, we'd all panic. You know, where's the dog? Are they confined? How are they acting? You know, does the child have to have rabies shots? You know, we would totally panic if this was a dog bite. But humans bite more often than dogs do. The human bite is potentially more dangerous. Unless the dog has rabies, the human bite is more dangerous than the dog bite. A cat bite is the only other animal bite that I think is, you know, more dangerous than the human bite. We need to realize that it's the dirtiest part of our mouth, our whole body. But the other thing, too, is it a child bite or is it an adult bite? When we see children biting, you know, a lot of times it's just part of growth and development. It's still in that oral phase, you know, sucking your thumb, you know, cutting teeth where you're gnawing on things. So sometimes a child will bite just in that stage as normal growth and development. A lot of times they won't repeat it. They don't do it another time for a couple reasons. One, it may taste bad and they don't like the taste and they don't do it. But most of the time it's the reaction. They bite, they get whopped, they don't do it again. If you have a child that continues to bite, now you're talking about you're potentially going to have some behavior modification, because it isn't something that you would want to have a child continue to do. One of my little grandsons bit me a couple weeks ago, and I actually was glad he bit me that day instead of a week later, because the day he bit me, he had 2 little sharp razor blades. He had 4 more teeth, so he would have had 6 the next weekend, and it was like, those things hurt. So, bites, but you need to know, is it a child bite or is it an adult? When we see adults biting a child, a lot of times, it's that the daycare provider said, hey, Susie bit Tommy in daycare today. And a lot of times then, the adult will say, or the child has actually bitten the adult, the caretaker, and they say, how would you like to know how that felt? And they bite the child. Inappropriate, but we will see it. So is it an adult bite or is it a child-sized bite? Sometimes we will see adults that are psychosocial deviants that will gnaw. It's just like corn on the cob. And so obviously one of those, you're talking about a psychosocial deviant, you're talking about major counseling problems, with emotional and mental health issues. And so what kind of a bite is it? Is it animal? Is it human? Is it child or adult? Cigarette burn, not a lot of meat on our knuckles, that went all the way to the bone. Child being tied, and you can see, that actually was more than just the wrist. The ankles were tied also. Sometimes we're seeing in drug cultures as a safety factor. And of course, when you're talking about it is wrong thinking in the first place. A lot of times, the caretakers, the parents are under influence. But if my child's a Houdini, if I put them down for a nap, they're going to wake up, they're going to pop out of that bed, they're going to be right out here in the middle of it. And, we're cooking meth in a little while. I don't want my child hurt. So I'll tie them up in their bed to keep them safe. Sometimes it's, I've got some really kinky friends. They like kids and sex, and so, I'm going to protect my child. I'll tie him up in bed. And so obviously it's still very wrong, very incorrect, and very damaging. This would be considered an anklet burn. The child she was actually able to pull her right foot, and so that's why the burn isn't as deep and as far down on the ankle. When we're talking about fractures, children's bones don't have as much calcium in them as the adult bone has, so they don't break usually in a straight across, like our bones where it would break straight across. We see them more in a diagonal break like that one and like that one. The other thing is because they don't have as much calcium, a lot of times they're considered as a green stick fracture. So like if you cut a twig, if you pick one up off the ground and you snap it, it usually will break across. If you cut one off a tree, you can bend, eventually it will break. It'll break at an angle. The same thing with a child's bone. Usually it will break at that angle. Sometimes the bone doesn't break, clear through, and so sometimes they're referred to as green stick fractures. More often, instead of just that bend, we see that twisting, ringing type of activity, which will cause it to be that kind of an angle. This child's, the femur, the thigh bone, is actually broken pretty much straight across. A caretaker said the child was taking a nap, and while he was asleep, he dropped a leg through the bars on the bed. When he woke up, he was on one side, leg was on the other. He fought, he twisted, and he pulled, and he broke his own leg. As humans, we all have a pain threshold. It's individual to us. But when we have reached our pain threshold, we will quit fighting. So the chances of this happening that way is very, very slight. But then let's say it did happen that way. Let's say that the child, did drop a leg through. Safety factors, the bars on the bed are really not supposed to be that far apart anymore. You can pretty much get a hand through, but you shouldn't be able to get a chunky leg outside of the bed. Where were the bumpers or where were the guards? But even more than that, if this child is twisting and turning and pulling till they break their own leg, they're going to be screaming bloody murder too. Somebody should have heard the child crying and gotten to it before this had ever happened. So think about it, about what is the story, what is the history, what matches. Where the arrow is a depressed skull fracture. Caretaker said she was doing the laundry, she was coming through the kitchen, and the child was sitting in a high chair, and she just accidentally hit him in the back of the head with the laundry basket. Unless she's washing bricks, it couldn't have happened that way. The skull is the toughest part of our body. And so you cannot do that with a laundry basket. Think about the time if you've ever had a black eye. Some people have never even experienced one, but most of us, if we've had a black eye, most of the time it's here. It's our cheekbone that gets black and blue. Sometimes it'll be entire circle, especially if it's been a direct blow from a fist or a baseball, something like that, that's been thrown. We may end up with the black and blue all the way around. When you see the black and blue that is just the upper eyelid, usually it's because there's a fracture at some point above that. So where the dip is in her eyebrow, there actually is a skull fracture. So the skull fracture up above the eye will cause just the upper eyelid to be black and blue like that. Father doubled up his fist and he hit his 12-year-old daughter, and he caught her high up into the forehead and broke it rather than catching her eye. Mongolian spots are birthmarks. But remember, it's our responsibility to report suspected abuse, not to prove it, not to know what it is, the difference between a Mongolian spot, a birthmark, and a bruise. But likewise, if this is my child, it's my responsibility to protect my child. So if I'm bringing you to daycare for the first time, it's my responsibility to say, well, by the way, those aren't bruises on their face. Those are birthmarks, and here's the birth record, because it will be in the birth record that that's what they look like. You're going to find Mongolian spots or birthmarks in dark-complexioned infants. It could be African American, but it also can be Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Native Alaskans, Filipinos, Italians, anyone that has a darker complexion. A couple trains of thought. One is that they disappear as the child ages. The other train of thought is the skin darkens as the child ages. Since it's a birthmark, it is still there. You just can't see it. And if we don't know that that's what this is, we're still going to have to report it. We can't say we're reporting bruises because we don't know. But what are some of the other things that we could say? Is there any rainbow effect? Is there any difference in the color? Or, is there other colors there other than just the dark browns, purple type thing? The other thing is, how's the child acting? Do they duck when we come into their space? So those would be part of it, but we would still have to report it. We also have the child with this particular case is around the knee and at the ankle point. There's also a scratch there. So it's like, okay, is there another problem? Could it be something other than Mongolian spots? A situation like this, and we'll talk about it, whether it's abuse or not, this is called Kowgow or coining. And generally, predominantly, it's an Asian medical spiritual practice. So now we're talking cultural diversity, and we've all had our classes on that, and so we'll talk about it whether it's abuse or not. The child either has had a backache or an upper respiratory infection, a bad cold, and a silver coin, which is where it gets its name, the edge of a silver spoon, a porcelain cup, a porcelain plate, is used to rub really hard over the area that is either in diseased or has a spiritual problem. So the idea is to rub out the bad spirits, to rub out the disease. So it's called coining. We'll get back to it in a moment. This one, there are a lot of cultures. It is called cupping, although there are a lot of other names for it. It's usually it's a suction cup that is heated, and it could even be heated with as little as just a match. For the most part, I always used to say it was a Hispanic medical spiritual practice. And in the sense that I am aware that Chinese medicine does use something very similar to that. But I also know that there are some of the Sudanese cultures use it. I also know that some of the Russian, Ukrainian cultures, and there's probably a lot of others, but those are the ones that I've become aware of since then, they also use that. The object is, in this particular case, those aren't burns. Those are is like a hot hickey. So they're sucking out the spirit. They're sucking out the disease process. It's a suction type of action. Okay, so then is it abuse? Well, I have a friend that investigates child abuse, and she said, of course it is. You have a child, you have a circumstance, you have someone taking care of it. It is abuse. She said, but we're also talking culture. It could be that they don't know that. It could be the caretakers are not aware of what Iowa's law is on abuse. So she said she will go to the house and she'll sit down and talk to the caretakers and tell them what Iowa's law is on it, what's going on with it. And she'll tell them that she's not going to file an abuse report this time, But if she's called back, if she sees it again, she will have to file an abuse report. I have another friend who's a child abuse investigator said, hey, no way. Wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's their cultural, their spiritual right to do their practices. So here we have even two investigators within the same department with two different opinions. We are people working with people. So then my first friend said, okay, well, let's talk about the law. You know, the father of this child, he's driving down a street and he runs a red light. An officer pulls him over and says, you know, excuse me, sir, are you aware that you ran a red light? He said, hey, we don't have red lights in my country. Is he going to get a ticket? Yes. And I checked on it. It's not a warning. He will get a ticket for running a red light because it's the law. Okay, so what happens is we have got to report it, regardless of what our beliefs are, our background, our culture. We have got to report it as suspected abuse. Now, what happens could be that we don't like the result. It could be we come up with someone that says they have a right to their practices. We may come up with someone that says it's against the law. This is how we're going to deal with it. But it's our legal responsibility to make that report. We're going to talk about sexual abuse. You know, we are talking about a sexual offense. This is another one of those that actually, even before physical abuse, will jump between civil and criminal really fast. By law, it has to be within 72 hours if there is suspected sexual abuse. You know, so it won't stay just within the realm of civil code. It will jump to criminal code. So we've got a sexual offense. We're talking about with or to a child. There's that word omissions again. So same scenario. If my significant other is sexually abusive to me, there's a good probability it will be sexually abusive to my kids, and yet I leave them unattended. You know, if they are sexually abused in my absence, he can be charged as the perpetrator. I can be charged with sexual abuse by omission because I failed to keep my kids safe. And so there's always that level of who's responsible. Because we're talking about criminal code, and I know that some of the additional links that you have available from this site, one of them is on Iowa statutes, and it is a list of the Iowa criminal codes on sexual abuse. And so that is an additional handout that you do have available. But these subcategories, these are just some of the subcategories that are listed under those criminal codes on sexual abuse. The last one, the invasion of privacy or nudity, was the last one that was added. If you have a child that is mature enough to bathe, dress, and toilet without assistance, they have a right to privacy and nudity. You do not have the right to touch, to photograph, to do anything. They have that right. If you have a child that's not mature enough or incapable of bathing, toileting, dressing without assistance, you know, they have that the caretaker can help, but still cannot inappropriately touch, photograph, etc. So regardless of the age of the child, they do have that right of privacy and the right of nudity without someone else, you know, interacting with that, interjecting on it. So sex crimes based on age. And a lot of times I get the questions about, what about statutory rape? What about the 4-year rule? Those are criminal codes. I'm not an attorney. I have absolutely no intention of talking, you know, in depth about criminal code. You know, I'm talking about child abuse. From that standpoint, you know, from a civil standpoint, there is not an age of consent. You can have two 7-year-olds having playing doctor. It's a sexual activity. You can have a teenager that goes in for birth control, goes in for pregnancy testing. You know, you can have the children have those rights of consent for sexual activity. So then you have to think about, you know, the other ages. And so you do, once again, you do have available on this site, you have a handout that says sex acts. And on that, it does have the child's age down the left column. It has the adult age across the top, or even the perpetrator as a younger age. And then it tells you based on age what potentially can they be charged with. But so you do have the ability, you do have that available to you. But we're talking about they have the right of consent. So say that I walk in my house and there's my 16-year-old. She's having sex with this guy. I don't like him. She's been told she's never to have anything to do with him. He definitely isn't supposed to be at my house having sex with my daughter. I call the police because I want him out of her life. I'm going to charge him with rape. So the police department, because I wouldn't even think about calling human services first. So the police department probably, because we're talking a child, would up front get a hold of human services. Human Services are going to look at it, and they're going to say, okay, from the 3 C's, we have a child because she's 16. Mom's charging a sexual offense, and so we have a circumstance. The child is over the age of 11, under the age, so that they're not in that exception category. But in addition to that, the child is capable and mature enough to be home unattended by themselves, so it doesn't have to be a caretaker. It doesn't match. And so Department of Human Services will back out and turn it over to criminal because the 3 C's haven't been met. Okay, so then the police department are probably going to say to my daughter, did he hurt you? Heck no, we're in love. We're getting married in 2 years. Okay, the police department don't have a victim. There's a good probability that they'll back off because, she's not going to go along with this. There's no problem here. But then let's change the scenario a little bit. My daughter is profoundly developmentally disabled. So Human Services are going to look at it and they're going to go, we have a child because she's 16. We have a sexual assault because mom's charging rape, but where's the caregiver? And so in that particular case, it's going to go back on the parent. We'll be talking about that again in a little bit. But if there should be a caretaker there because of problems, and there's not, then they're the ones that's going to be responsible. So then let's take it from a police standpoint. And she goes, yeah, it got a little rough, I heard. Okay, now they have a potential criminal situation. And so they're going to say, let's go to the hospital. Let's do rape testing. Let's, have you checked over. And so it can go back and forth. It could go criminal. It could go civil. It could go back and forth a little bit based on those circumstances with it. But anytime there's any pain, any threats, any violence, anything, doesn't matter how old we are, a child, an adult, we do have that protection, against any type of a sexual abuse situation. These are hickeys that were put on with the father to his daughter during intercourse. This is a rope burn, stepfather-stepdaughter situation. It didn't matter, how she felt, her comfort level. In addition to that, we're talking a sexual assault of a child. A lot of times when we're talking about rape, most of us understand that it's going to hurt, so there could be some potential for damage, some tearing, some bruising, some bleeding, infection. We've heard that for a long time. We understand that. But sometimes we don't think about some of the psychosocial indicators that we might see with it. So you suddenly, in addition to potential physical problems, you may say suddenly that a child is dropping language in or hints, that you may just, it's different behavior. You can see suddenly a child that does masturbate or does play doctor, suddenly there's that compulsion that they've stepped up their activities. There's a change. A child that is curious may suddenly want to play doctor with every kid in the neighborhood. It's like somebody looked at me, I just want to know what it's about. So that curiosity has been stepped up on that. You can have a child that's aggressive or seductive, and we're talking a change in behavior. I know of an 11-year-old that suddenly French kissed her father goodnight. It's like that wasn't part of their routine. A bedtime kiss was, but not a mouth-to-mouth, wasn't definitely a French kiss. So where did she learn that? Where did that suddenly come from with it? We're talking about a change in behavior. And suddenly that promiscuity, suddenly there's a lot of sexual activity. It's interesting, if we were talking about physical abuse, if you say that, my child had been struck or my child had been beaten, we'd want to look, who's the bad guy? Who just did this to my kid? When we're talking about sexual activity, for some weird reason, we stop and we think about what have we done first. And the usual question is, what movie were we watching last night after the kids went to bed? Like maybe the kids had sneaked out and were peeking around the corner. We think it's like, what did we do? Or who forgot to put the blocks on the computer? When we're talking sexual activity, we have a tendency to blame ourselves first and then go, that didn't happen, so where did this come from? So we're talking about indicators. Regression is a thing. You have a teenager, you might say, that suddenly will be acting childlike. They may buy the candy pacifiers. You may see them start taking their teddy bear to bed with them again. They don't want to go anywhere. They want to stay home. If they're babysitting, you might see them actually saying, hey kids, let's play house. I get to be the baby. That they're regressing to it, because if I had been younger, if I had been a baby, this wouldn't have happened to me. You might see a younger child that's starting into being very independent, And now all of a sudden, they've got their arms wrapped around your leg. Everywhere you go, there's this kid hanging on to you again. That's because it's like, I don't trust being away from you. There's been a problem. So you may see a child regress, and depending on their age, how they actually will do that. With multiple layers of clothing. I mean, sometimes it is fad and fashion. But when you see that change in it, it's like, if I'd had more clothes on, this would have taken longer to get them off. This wouldn't have happened to me. And so once again, it's that change in behavior. If you have a child that's starting to be incontinent, involuntary, lack of bowel and bladder control, it could be like just the same thing. If I'd been a baby, if I'd had on a dirty diaper, this wouldn't have happened to me. Or it could, in fact, because we're talking sexual activity, it could be parts of the body are actually damaged to the point that there's that lack of bowel and bladder control. And then, obviously, another indicator would potentially be pregnancy. And then sexually transmitted diseases. But you're going to see behavior when we're talking about sexual indicators. I'm going to touch base a little bit with pornography, with child porn. It isn't a separate recognized category, but it ties in with child sexual abuse. Just a little bit of background, we're talking about age of consent. In the 1880s, and even earlier than that, the age of consent legally was 10 years old for girls. But you need to think about it was a time we had lost literally thousands with the Civil War. We lost thousands of Americans because of no immunization, so we had, diseases were rampant. We had landmass switches from East Coast to the West. So we really needed more children. Family needed more children to continue businesses and farming. But in addition to that, life expectancy, especially the earlier 1800s, was 35. A lot of people in the audience, me included, wouldn't be here any longer. And so we actually needed more children to continue with what we were doing with it. And so, it wasn't pornographic at that age. It was something that was allowed. In the 1970s, 1977 particularly, is the first time we started actually seeing written pornographic material available to the general public. Prior to that, it was pretty much an undercover type of thing, but we started seeing magazines, more printed material, and therefore likewise also federal laws. Earlier I had talked about it that the first child abuse law in Iowa was 1978. So this fits right in the same time frame as when we started to see more federal laws on child pornography. And then in the 80s, we started to see computer laws in pornography. Even in the 80s, we weren't talking about, personal computers and laptops. We were talking about room-sized business computers. And we still found pornographic materials in our room-sized business computers. And so it's been a problem. There are a lot of images out there. It's a daily habit. As many as like 200 images posted on a daily basis. And so we're talking about a major problem. 1 million sites in a month. Sometimes I'm online and I accidentally hit a pop-up and I go, whoa, and I get off of it absolutely as soon as I can. So we're not talking about those as hits. We're talking about somebody who's deliberately going back to that site that is pornographic with it. It's a lot of images. We're finding there are actually clubs that we're having members. They're having child pornographic clubs. We'd like to believe the United States isn't involved in it. We're the best country in the world. Unfortunately, we are. Part of it is because we're the best. We do have the economics to support a worldwide situation, but also we have the ability to travel worldwide more than a lot of other countries do. So the United States is definitely involved. I'm not sure why this particular study, and this was the United States Department of Justice, May of 2006. I'm not sure why they pointed out just Yahoo at that time and didn't pick on AOL or some of the other providers, other than just to say, look, people, you need to be aware the United States is a big player in this. We're talking about companies, major turnover in money, 1.4 million monthly turnover. That is a big business with child porn. And then clubs that are worldwide. And then the internet came along. And the internet just blew this wide open. If you think about prior to the internet, how did you have a club? How could you, especially worldwide, how did you communicate with anybody prior to the internet? How did you discuss child pornography with anyone else prior to the internet? But all of a sudden now we have blogs and we have chat rooms and MySpace, Facebook. We have all of these different ways to actually communicate with each other that a lot of ways aren't regulated to know that we're actually spreading pornographic material with it. The other thing you were talking about sexual abuse and the internet is the newest thing called sext messaging. Taking pictures of unclothed bodies, or even I know teenagers that are taking pictures, dressed in their underwear because it's just cool, and sharing those with friends. I was with a group of adults a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking, and I was totally appalled, and I was saying, are you aware about sext messaging? And there was a 13-year-old sitting right there, and she, big deal, happens every day. And then the adults, we were all just totally shocked by it. So you need to be aware that this is a problem, and it's a problem with our kids today. You may not be aware of the fact that your kids are involved in it. With the internet, our children, they're seeking out, perpetrators are seeking out and grooming our children. I think most of us have seen a 60 Minutes or a 20/20 expose where you have seen, the children, they've set up sting operations with the police departments, and they catch the perpetrator coming in to sexually assault a child when the adults aren't there. And a lot of times it starts out as simply or as innocently as, I'm 16 and I've broken a household rule. I can't go to the ball game tonight. They took away my cell phone. I told them I had an English lit project due, so they left me my computer. I'm in a chat room and I am complaining about my parents. My parents may not even know what a chat room is. They may not know anything at all about the fact other than I'm working on an English lit project. And I'm complaining. I'm in a chat room and I'm complaining about my parents. Click. A perpetrator clicks in and went, yeah, I told him it was a history project. I have a best friend already. We both have horrible parents. We're both grounded. We both lied. And I have a best friend already without ever knowing that this is an adult and not a child, and I have been set up. Okay, so it can happen as easily as that to find out where our children are. It does promote sexual tourism. If you're going to go on vacation, you're probably going to check out hotels, you're going to check out, activities, different. You're not going to just drive someplace. You're going to think about it ahead of time. Something that most people don't realize is that, we know that every 10 years we have a United States federal census. At the same time we do a federal census, we generally do an Iowa census. We generally do a county census wherever you live. We do a city census or a town census. But something else that's available that most people don't realize are called census tracts. They actually are a 7 or 8 block area that you can break it all the way down. In the country, they're a little bigger tracts because we're talking about population, but they actually can bring it all the way down within 7 or 8 blocks of your house. And the same information that you can get on your federal census and your state census as far as number of children, the ages, the economic base, you can actually get that information. So now a perpetrator can look at it and know how many children live in that area. Also, what's the economics? Are there more parents probably out working than there are potentially adults at home? And so they can go online and come down a track within just a short distance away from your home. When we're talking about trafficking, again, we would like to believe that the United States isn't involved. The latest statistics that I heard on, there are over 800,000 people bought and sold annually worldwide. 66% of them are children. 50% of them are female. And so trafficking is a worldwide problem. We'd like to think the United States isn't involved, but in fact we are. Again, because of the ability to travel, again, because of economics. The two times that we see that a step up and increase in that is one is natural disasters, like the tsunami. When the tsunami hit Indonesia, what a lot of people didn't realize is that when it hit the coastline, the children and families lived inland. The adults, the parents, caretakers worked on the coast. And so we had thousands of adults that left a lot of children without caretakers. Hundreds of orphanages sprang up. Someone from the United States or any other country can go in and say, hey, this $300, I'm not buying any of the kids here. But this would sure feed a lot of the rest of the kids, just even $300. I'll take the child back to the United States for the American dream. And you don't even have to define that. To Americans, to world people in other countries other than America, that is major as the American dream. Let's take the child back. The other time we see it is with third world countries where birth control is an issue. It's the same thing. Hey, I'm not buying your child, but this money will sure feed the rest of your children. And again, they're not brought back to the United States through legal channels. They're brought back illegally for sexual purposes. So you need to be aware of that. You can actually go online and mail order your children. You can go online. What do you want? A 10-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl? You want a 5-year-old dark-complexioned, brown-eyed little boy? You can go online and pick your kids. We're going to switch and talk about mental injury. Basically what mental injury is that the child is not functioning at their chronological age. Probably one of the worst cases, and I wasn't actively involved in it, so the details may not be completely accurate, but the scenario is. A neighbor had called to say that she hadn't seen the neighbor children. So when Department of Human Services went to the house to check it out, the mom was a combination of mental health issues and substance abuse. Didn't have to have a warrant or anything. Mom said, hey, come on in. And so the person said, oh, you have toys, you have children? She said, sure, let me show you. So she took the Department of Human Services employee upstairs to a locked room. When they unlocked the room was filled with cats and a set of 2-year-old twin boys. Now, there wasn't enough kitty litter, etc., to take care of that number of cats. The place was a real pit. Likewise, nobody taking care of the children. The place was not only very soiled and very filthy. The little boys' faces were pretty clean because as the cats would groom themselves, they'd wash the little boys' faces up. So their faces were pretty clean. 2-year-olds who have started into quite a bit of independence, a lot of times they have progressed away from a bottle or into a sippy cup, if not an actual glass. Both had baby bottles. The milk was spoiled in the baby bottles. Sometimes a 2-year-old is starting into some type of toilet training. Both of them were wearing diapers that had not been changed, so they were very soiled. They had problems with diaper rash. 2-year-olds don't use full sentences most of the time, but they do have communication skills. No is their favorite word as a 2-year-old. And so you have a child, they say mommy, daddy, cookie, kitty. They do have language skills. These 2-year-olds had spent time, could not talk, they meowed. And so they were functioning below their chronological age. Their verbal communication was with where they were associated, which was with the cats. So then it does have to be diagnosed or confirmed by either a physician or a master prepared licensed social worker. And I don't know if you've ever had any type of psychosocial testing, but it's not like going in for a flu shot. You go in, you're out again. With psychosocial testing, potentially it can take months. And so, the Department of Human Services will go ahead usually and charge them with, and we'll talk about denial of critical care in a moment, but they usually will charge them with something to hold the case open while the psychosocial testing is being done. But there's things, what causes mental injury in addition to living with cats? Totally ignoring a child, or not validating their worth. I wish you'd never been born. I wish I'd never had you. Imagine how you would feel if that's what you heard when you were growing up, that they really didn't want you to exist. Well, that rejecting them, that's the stupidest thing I heard anybody say. Hey, your 5-year-old brother is smarter than you are, can do math better. It's that constant put down with it. As far as, isolating a child, living with cats, children being caged, they come in the front door of daycare and we find them in the cage in the back. That we've had cases like that. And so we have, persons that are being isolated from that normal interaction. Terrorizing a child. You just wait to get home tonight. I'm going to beat you within an inch of your life. Hey, I'm not going home. I'll break other house rules before I'll go home. And then usually what happens is, you're going to get it worse when you go home. Then you get big enough that you fight back and it stops. A couple months ago, I was doing a training. 100% of the people that were involved in the training said that was a daily occurrence at their house. That they heard that every day of their lives until they got big enough to fight back. That I'm going to beat you within an inch of your life. Corrupting a child. I know a felon that by law does not have the legal right to have a weapon, and that includes guns, knives, crossbows. But he did have a gun. He taught his 7-year-old how to load it, how to fire it, how to clean it. His 7-year-old got into a fight with the neighbor kids. And he went home, he loaded his dad's gun, and he took it back to the apartment complex. Dad said, hey, way to go, chip off the old block. He was already programming, training his child into a felon style of life. So you could have them corrupting children. Verbally assaulting, name-calling. Periodically on the internet, on email, I'll see it. It comes across as a joke. about the 5-year-old that it was the first day of kindergarten before he realized his name wasn't Dammit. Because it was always, damn it, do this, damn it, do that. I was talking to a group of people that said, that they'd been called worse names, things even than that, and sometimes didn't realize what their name actually was for a while. It's not funny. We're having children that really are hurt in those kind of ways. And then overpressuring, setting the bar too high. Hey, nobody in our family have ever come home with less than an A-. That's a high bar. And we have children that it's easy for them, they can handle that. That's not a problem at all. We have children that will not participate, will not become social beings, will not interact with other things because they need to maintain that bar. They want to maintain it. But what about the child that says, I don't even understand math. I can't even get a C in math. I don't understand it. Already they're below the bar. And so they're going to be, having problems because they're being overpressured. What about young Olympians? Go for the gold. We've set that bar. Where are they with other things, with socialization, with interaction, even with school? Are they being tutored, or are they having to have special education, special classes for it? And so all of those things can cause mental injury and other problems for our children. We're going to switch and we're going to talk about denial of critical care. Denial of critical care, these are the basics. These are the basic human rights that all of us have: food, shelter, clothing. You can see it also as supervision. Also, we need to have the ability to not have life-threatening conditions, at least to be protected if we have life-threatening conditions. And so we have problems with those. The children have those rights. If the caretakers or the parents, if they don't have the money or the services are not available, it would not be considered child abuse. And based on economic times, we see this kind of ebb and flow. There are times, that economics are low, services have been halted or have been canceled. We may see a change in this. When economics are fairly good, the state's pretty much covered under most services with it. And then as far as anything based on a legitimate religious belief. We've sometimes heard, situations where the caretakers said we don't want surgery, blood products, and there may be other types of things that they don't want based on a religious belief. It has to be a legitimate religious belief. I had a person once tell me that it wasn't going to happen because they belonged to the Portland, Oregon Church of the Body Piercings. It's not a legitimate religious belief. Okay, so that has to be part of it. But even that, the child still has that right to be safe, the right to be protected from life-threatening. And so a court can actually intercede if, in fact, based on a legitimate religious belief, the child is still at risk. The court can intercede and override that religious belief. And then minimal versus optimal. Unless a city code, a county code says we have to have running water and indoor plumbing, we don't have to. AOL did a study last year that was the top 10 things that were going to disappear from our culture in the next 15 or 20 years, and outhouses was in the top 10. There's still 1/10 of 1% of the United States population using an outhouse. And I know some people don't even know what one is, and so you don't have to have indoor plumbing. You can have an outhouse. Same way with electricity. We can't mandate electricity. We have a large population of Amish in Iowa that they don't use electricity. And so we can't mandate electricity, but we can mandate care. And so if you have a child, and especially if they're on a respirator, a nebulizer, any type of thing like that's an assistive device, electrical that they have to have, we can legally mandate the care. And so we have to find someplace safe for the child to be, or the caretakers have to get electricity. Presence of illegal drugs in a child's body. A couple real key words. One is illegal. It is illegal for a child to have possession of tobacco. It's illegal for a child to have possession of alcohol. It's illegal to share prescription drugs. But those are acts. Those aren't possession of an illegal drug. So we are talking about cocaine, heroin, marijuana, the amphetamines, methamphetamine. We're talking about illegal drugs. The other key word is child's body. In Iowa, a child is not a child until birth. You have a fetus, then you have a child. And so we're talking about, obviously, then you have to have after the birth of the child in order to be able to find out if there's presence of illegal drugs. So therefore, it has to be confirmed by a lab report. We're not talking about in a fetal state. The two times we basically see that is mom's using, mom's pregnant, so we're talking about a fetus, we're not talking about a child. Mom is using. You know, you can always tip a midwife or a medical center, a hospital, obstetrics unit off to the fact that you deal with substance abuse. You've got a mom who's using, who's going to be delivering soon. And you wouldn't have to even use a name because they just give them that heads up on it. You know, most of the time, Iowa doesn't mandate all newborns are drug tested. But it does have, usually all hospitals, medical centers have a protocol that if they see certain indicators, they will automatically drug test. And so if you give them a heads up, they're going to be ready. They're going to be watching every infant then for just some potential problems. The other time that we can have a child with illegal drugs in their system is a child in an environment situation. Cooking meth and have been for a while, the child's crawling on the carpet. You know, they've got their hands are contaminated, they suck their thumb, they're in their mouth, drop the sucker, pick it up and put it back in. Inhaling the fumes with it so they can have drugs in their body. One of the latest things is it's called Crankachino, and it's like cappuccino, so you have coffee and chocolate mixtures. This is actually dissolving methamphetamine in coffee. It's called Crankachino. And so you can have a child that's ingesting the drugs, inhaling the drugs, you know, assimilating it. Some indicators then, you know, if you have a midwife or an obstetrics unit, you know, and they see the physical indicators, the low birth weight, the defects and those things, they already have a protocol. If they've had a heads up, they'll be looking for these things. But in addition to that, you know, when they see these, they will drug test. If they don't have a protocol, they will get an order for it. But then some of the additional problems you would see, like skin problems. If any of you have worked with methamphetamine addicts, there is a problem that's called meth mites. It's not an actual bug. It's the sensation of bugs crawling. You know, and so you may see a meth addict that literally has scratched their skin off. They just have grooved it, you know, because they're scratching meth mites. So if you have a child that's got the same deep grooves, they are scratching. It's the same thing. There's a probability of methamphetamines on board. You know, with dental problems, most of the illegal drugs leach calcium out of the body, bones and teeth. We have a situation right now that our highest drug usage is ages 24 to 35. You know, and we have a situation right now that if we talk about dentures, most of the time we would be talking about, if we were talking about a younger person with dentures, it would be because of an accident that they had lost them. Otherwise, we consider dentures an old person's problem. We're starting to see a lot of 24 to 35-year-olds with full plates because of that leach of calcium and poor dentition. You know, with a child, it could be, you know, it could be that Kool-Aid in the baby bottle from the time they were born. That could be part of the problem. Or in fact, it could be because they have drugs on board, that they've got those severe dental problems. You know, if you look at these 5 type of psychosocial problems, and you look at these 4, they're basically the same as attention deficit disorder. I wonder how many children are being treated as attention deficit when in fact we have a problem with drugs. And we need to be aware of the fact. Child prostitution. Child prostitution, we don't see a lot of it in Iowa, but we do see it. We're seeing a lot of it, more of it even in our drug cultures. If I'm a meth addict and I've already sold my car and my TV and everything that's not nailed down, what else do I have? Okay, and so prostitution can be part of that. The other thing is we had a grandma in Iowa that was prostituting her grandchildren in a local motel to supplement Social Security. And so that could be, you know, prostitution, we do see it. I know there was a situation in North Carolina just within a recent period of time where they actually saw a handoff. Mom handed off the 5-year-old and then disappeared with a man into a motel. And so they had that as a prostitution potential, but then the child disappeared. And so they did find her murdered at a later date. And so, you know, we do have child prostitution in the United States. Fortunately, we just don't have that much of it in Iowa. Manufacture or possession of a dangerous substance. This basic law was predominantly written for methamphetamine production. Okay? And so it's where a child can see it, smell it, or hear it. Okay? So we're talking rolling meth labs in the houses, in the yards. I mean, we're talking about chemicals, so it's where they can see, smell, or hear it. Not only was it written for methamphetamine as the drug, but also the precursors, the chemicals and the substances that you combine to make methamphetamine. But something else, too, is this part about risk of explosion, fire, or danger. What about a gas can in your kids in the back of a pickup or the back seat of a car? Could you be charged? Possibly. Will you? Depends on the circumstances. Probably not. But it could be used for something other than methamphetamine production. This is one of those that jumps immediately, as fast as possible, from civil to criminal law, because we are talking about methamphetamine most of the time, but we're also talking about precursors for meth. I don't know if you've spent any time working or I don't say working on producing meth, but I've spent any time with methamphetamine addiction and the problems. These are just some of the products that can be used to put together, the precursors that can be used for methamphetamine production. There's some pretty nasty things on that list. And then you say, but there's coffee filters. Big deal. I mean, my grandkids know where my coffee filters are. But if the coffee filter has been used to filter methamphetamine production, it now is one of the most dangerous things up there. Depending on what is used, the crystals could be a light pink color. Talking about from a child's perspective, you have light pink crystals. Could be cherry candy, lifesavers. Could be cherry pop, strawberry pop, pink. It's enticing to a child. Depending on what's mixed, it could be a tan color, a brown color. Root beer, Coca-Cola, caramels. It could be totally clear. On a hot day, ice, which is another name for methamphetamine, is ice. But also to a child, diamonds, I'm rich. You've got those clear, sparkly things. And so, it depends on what's used and what's made. It could, in fact, be that most dangerous thing to a child. As far as homes, again, the average ages still are 24 to 35-year-olds. Those are also our greatest childbearing ages with it. And so we have a lot of people, a lot of homes where we're talking about methamphetamines, other illegal drugs, and children. And we also know from many of the reports is, they don't take time and put all this garbage in a biohazard bag, and appropriately dispose of it. It's just left, or it's just pitched wherever it happens to be that the drugs are being manufactured. And so we have a lot of toxic waste out there that is just as dangerous to all of us as it is to our children and other people. This is a drawing by Romeo. Romeo is 4 years old. Romeo is functioning at a slight mental disability. Most 4-year-olds can count at least to 10, and most of them, they know their alphabet, they know the little song, A, B, C, D, they know those things. They're getting ready to start kindergarten. Romeo is 4 years old. He does have a slight mental injury. He cannot count past 8. He doesn't know his entire alphabet. He can't sing the jingle. So he is functioning at a slight mental injury or below his chronological age. But Romeo can do something that most, fortunately, our children or our grandchildren can't do. Romeo can draw a meth lab. The two figures that are on the right-hand side, unless they're talking about intravenous drugs, that looks almost like an IV bag, but the ones that are on the left-hand side of it, that's the distillation process for methamphetamine. And so we have a 4-year-old that can draw a meth lab because he's there. The additional thing, I don't know if you've ever seen a self-portrait of a 4-year-old. Right above the uppercase C on your copyright, there's a drawing of a little figure. That is Romeo. He has drawn a picture of himself. So he's actually drawn himself into a drug situation. If these guys showed up here right now, I'd panic. And I know why they're here. But, think about, the aliens suddenly showed up. Think about it from a child's perspective. But in addition to that, the difference in the way the child who's been in a drug situation, how they are dressed and not being protected, compared to what we would have to keep us safe. We're not going to spend time on this next slide when we're talking about addicted caretakers or parents. Obviously it is part of your material. But the ones that are in red, children are really at risk when you're talking about drug-addicted parents, substance abuse, because they are no longer focused on the child. So we're talking about the violence, talking about illegal activities. We're talking about real problems for our children. Bestiality in the presence of a minor. Basically what this means is that either the caretaker is allowing the child to have sexual activities with animals, or the caretaker is having sexual activity with animals. And sometimes I'm really naive, and I think, hey, this couldn't be, it's Iowa. I mean, this couldn't be happening. We had a situation of a 17-year-old who was profoundly developmentally disabled. He was having sex with any animal that crossed the city square. Okay, so we have, from the 3 C's, we have a child because he's 17. We have a sexual activity, so we have a circumstance. He's profoundly developmentally disabled. Where's the caretaker? And so in this particular case, the caretakers could be charged with bestiality or by omission, or more likely they probably are going to be charged with denial of critical care, lack of supervision, lack of physical or mental health care. But they could be charged 2 different ways with that. This last year we had a situation with a child psychologist that worked at a Tacoma Regional Health Center in Iowa. His hard drive, his computer wasn't working. He took it to Best Buy at Coral Ridge Mall. When Best Buy cracked his hard drive, it was solid child pornography and bestiality. He did go to court. He was sentenced to prison. I normally would have just kind of left it at that, not followed through. But after a session a few months back, someone said, "Are you aware that he's dead?" He died on a prison bus. A lot of times when you're talking about especially a child sexual perpetrator, they are in total isolation. They're kept away from the main population, etc. Supposedly he died of a heart attack. I don't know, but I also know had he been in general population, he wouldn't have survived either. But now the biggest problem that everybody has in that area is they have to literally look at all those photos to say, do we know these kids? Do we have children in Iowa that are involved in pornography and bestiality that we need to get them some help? So it does happen in Iowa. This is one of those, again, that's going to jump really fast from civil code to criminal code. This is the last one, number 9, and this was a change. Prior to 2009, what the law stated from 2006 to 2009 was cohabits with a registered sex offender. That's what the law said. But basically that almost put it on that it's the child's fault for living with or residing with a registered sex offender. And so this year, that's in 2009, they changed it to say it allows access to. So this puts the problem back on the caretaker. So it's that they knowingly allow unsupervised access to the child with the sex offender. And so that would actually include custody cases. That yes, they could have the custody, but you still have to have some type of a supervision with it. They also added an age, that up to age 14, because pretty much after age 14, there is a bit of consent with that. And then also, if in fact the child has mental or disabilities, physical disabilities, it can actually go all the way up to age 18 or to being an adult. And so they changed it. Unfortunately, they didn't change the exceptions. If the registered sex offender is a parent of the minor child or the child, it doesn't count. Because you can't say that parents can interact with their children. Now, you can deny it and you can limit it, but overall, the registered sex offender would have access in some way to the child. If the registered sex offender is married to the caretaker, so if I own and operate a daycare and my spouse is on the registry, you can't compromise my livelihood because of his activities, and so it doesn't count. If it's my minor child that's on the registry, you can't say that I can't have my child living with me. And so they have exceptions there. So unfortunately, the exceptions are going to be so broad and cover so many areas that they're going to have to turn right around and call another problem. They're going to have to say that they're involving law enforcement with it, that it is part of a criminal code. In addition to that, they're going to end up charging them with denial of critical care. So they're going to still get them in some way. It may not just be to the letter of the law of what we had hoped for them to get. We're going to talk just a little bit about statistics. In 2008, these are the number of accepted cases. In Iowa, there were 23,236 cases accepted for assessment evaluation in Iowa. Some of the reason for that unique children, basically what that means, of those 23,000 cases, there were 28,842 children. because obviously some cases had more than one child involved. So that's the difference in those numbers. But you can see still that the majority of them were the fact that they were unconfirmed. We did not have enough evidence to say that they were founded, that they had happened. Doesn't mean they didn't. It means the evidence possibly wasn't there, or in fact they didn't happen. When we're talking about, again, 2008, the majority of the children, more than 50% of the time, the child is 5 years of age or younger. So we're talking about our youngest young of our children that are being abused. And when we're talking about the different 9 categories, and in 2008, remember, it still was cohabits with a registered sex offender. And so in 2008, it still includes that part of the law instead of access to. And, the child prostitution and bestiality are zeros. It doesn't necessarily mean that there were no cases. In fact, what it means is they fell off the chart. Percentage-wise, it would be like 0.00562, and so they fall off the chart. We had the cases, but statistically they were very minor. But some of the additional facts with it is in 2008, the majority of the child abuse cases that were investigated was a first time. So these were not repeat offenders. These were not repeat calls involving the same children, the same families. These were first-time victims. Statistically, it shows that we're pretty much male and female are equal, statistically are equal, except for sexual abuse. And part of it's personal bias on my part. I think it really isn't true that much. I think that with sexual abuse, the problem that I have heard is reporting. That boys report less frequently than girls report sexual assault. Part of it is because the threat I've heard is you tell, I cut it off. And that is a major threat for a guy, regardless of how old they are. The other reason that, for my personal belief on that, is that now as adults, we are seeing more men come forth and talk about abuse issues than we are seeing girls, because women reported it when they were girls. And so I think it is even still pretty well balanced. The additional problem is the biggest times on that 0 to 5 are during toilet training years. Those are tough times. If you've ever attempted to toilet train a child or remember even your own, those are really tough times. One of my grandchildren was doing really well as far as toilet training, and then his parents bought a puppy. And it was like, well, honey, why didn't you tell us you had to go? He said, the puppy peed, the puppy pooped. As soon as they had the dog trained, so was the kid. And so sometimes we set up our own problems and situations with that. When we're talking about, as far as the perpetrators or the most abusive people, generally we're talking parents and female caretakers. Female more than male, just because there are more women that own and operate daycares than there are men. There are more women that babysit. The additional, when we're talking about domestic violence situations, a lot of domestic violence situations, there are children involved. So children are at an even greater risk. And also when we investigate child abuse cases, a lot of times we also find domestic violence. In the 14 years between 1995 and 2009, there were 124 women in Iowa murdered in a domestic violence situation. There were 23 men. There were 42 bystanders, meaning just people that happened to be there at the time that incident happened. 20 of those 42 were children that lost their lives during that time. There were 151 children in Iowa that had a parent murdered in that 14-year period of time, and there were 62 kids that actually witnessed the murder of a parent. So domestic violence and child abuse in Iowa, it does go hand in hand in a lot of cases. When we're talking about homicides of a child, especially when we're talking shaken or slammed baby, I would have thought, that it would have been boyfriend first and then father and then mother. But statistically, the father is responsible more often than the boyfriend, than the mother. The outcomes of a child abuse investigation. If the abuse is serious, if it is continuous, if we have enough evidence to say that it has happened, we can prove the case, it's going to become a founded case. That name, the perpetrator's name, is going to be on the registry for 10 years. It will be part of a criminal background check. And so the perpetrator, the person on the registry, will not be able to work with children or dependent adults for 10 years. Department of Human Services, there are no discretions on our major cases. Obviously our prostitution, our drug charges, mental injury. But they do have, some leeway when we're talking about denial of critical care. Some of those reports, some very minor physical issues, clothing. We're talking about minor issues. And the key phrases then when they're looking at those are minor, isolated, and unlikely to reoccur. And so, yes, we know it happened. The offense is minor, isolated, and unlikely to reoccur. And it's in our minor categories, like some physical abuse and some denial of critical care. Then we have a situation where we know it happened, we have the evidence to it, but they'll confirm the report and not put the perpetrator on the registry. So it's not part of a criminal record. Their job isn't going to be hampered because it has happened. And those are the ones that definitely do fall into that minor, isolated, and unlikely to reoccur category. So in fact, we know it happened, but it's considered minor, and they won't be on the registry. And then sometimes we say it's non-confirmed. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. We just may not have enough evidence. And in other cases, we can prove that it didn't happen. There are sometimes there really are allegations that it was just potentially even trying to get a person into trouble. And so we do have some cases where in fact it didn't happen. Mandatory reporters. I started out saying that I am a registered nurse, but I'm not a mandatory reporter. And the key to it is the term employment. In the course of employment, I never examine, attend, counsel, or treat a child. And so it's based on employment. Okay? I used to be a mandatory reporter, changed jobs, now I'm not. So you could actually change. You may be mandatory, sometimes you may not. It's based on employment. I have people that will say, well, I'm a mandatory reporter because I signed a statement when I started to work saying I understood I was a mandatory reporter. But if you're not working that same job or you're off duty, you're not a mandatory reporter. If you're doing phone counseling, just because you're on call doesn't make you mandatory. If you're counseling on the phone, now you are mandatory. Surgical persons that are on call, EMS that are on call, are not mandatory until they're called and they are back on the clock or they're involved back again talking with children, examining, attending, counseling, or treating. I absolutely love Halloween. I'm a Halloween nut. This last October, I found it was absolutely the neatest thing. It was this 4.5-foot tall mummy. Top of its head's gone. It's a candy dish, but it wouldn't fit in my cart. And so I'm holding it in my arm, and I'm going down this hallway, this aisle in this store, and this lady comes flying out, and she starts yelling at me, and then she stopped, and she goes, I'm sorry, I'm a mandatory reporter for child abuse, and I thought you were dragging your grandson by his head. People have that perception of being a mandatory reporter. She's not a mandatory reporter in those circumstances. Okay. In addition to that, all my grandkids have the top of their heads. Okay, so you have to think about it from an employment standpoint, whether you're mandatory. But the law does allow us, to be a permissive reporter that we'll talk about. So you have other ways to it. Mandatory reporters generally fall under the 6 disciplines that are shown on the slide. And most of us in an employment, when we're dealing with children, we fall under one of those different categories. The list is very, very long. So, basically I have to look at it and say, am I a mandatory reporter? Whether you're mandatory or whether you're permissive in your reporting, and you have the legal right to do that, you have legal obligation as a mandatory reporter. I always say, if your heart hurts, do something about it. Make that report. As far as responsibilities of a mandatory reporter are concerned, you have to have an orientation to abuse within the first month of employment. You have to have at least the 2-hour course, the minimum 2-hour course, within the first 6 months of employment, and then you have to repeat the course every 5 years. Okay, if we're talking about child endangerment, if we're talking about any time a child is at risk, you need to call law enforcement, get the police department involved. If you personally feel that you are at risk dealing with a child, protect yourself too, call law enforcement, and then get the Department of Human Services involved in the case. You need to report orally within the first at least 24 hours of the time that you're aware of a situation. You need to get that report out. You need to get it in writing within 48 hours. You cannot report anonymously. As a mandatory reporter, you cannot report anonymously. You have to let them know. The question a lot of times comes in and said, okay, but will my name be on the report? Yes, it will, but it won't say, Di's the one that ratted you out. It'll say in the course of investigation, I talked to Di, to Cheryl, to Sarah, I've talked to different people. So your name will be in it, but it won't say that you were specifically the one that made that report. HIPAA confidentiality laws go out the window when you're talking about a child abuse report. You've got to make the report. You have to cooperate. If they ask you to preserve evidence, you do. If they need photos taken and ask you to do that, you do. You have to cooperate completely when you're talking about a child abuse report. As far as forms, it can be a form. It can be actually anything that encompasses all of the topics that you need to report. And you need to make the call. You need to call, you can use a statewide number. You also have local numbers that you can call. What I would recommend that you do, regardless of what part of the state that you're in, I would call the number that's listed here in your area and ask them, would you prefer that I call this number or the state number? So make those calls, find out what's the best place to do that. Make sure that you know what you're doing when you're making that report. The Department of Human Services, they have a 1-hour time frame. If in fact there is a problem, they're at high risk and immediate threat, they break it down then. They can do 12-hour time frames. They have 24 hours. They have 96 hours. So they have additional time frames that are all listed out. And some of the material that you do have access to, with this site does list them out in a lot of details. As far as, what the Department of Human Services are going to be doing, again, those are available to you, so we're not going to spend additional time talking about those. But, you do have that material available. You can take time to read it. If you are aware of an abuse situation, you are legally liable to make that report. You are guilty of a misdemeanor if you fail to make that report. You also can be guilty of a misdemeanor for making a false report. So you have got a liability to do it. You have got to make that report. And we've talked about it. We talked about multiple generations. It really does go full circle. We see families that are involved in it totally in a full circle of abuse. You have the child abuse, you have the sibling violence, you have dating violence, you have spousal abuse. So we do have a full circle. But you need to remember that it is your responsibility to report abuse.